Do you know what group was responsible for more homicides from 2000 to 2016 more than any other domestic extremist group?
Not sure, but I trust you're about to tell me.
Not a trick question. I raised that question because your testimony that was submitted to the committee talked a lot about homegrown violent extremists. In an unclassified FBI DHS Joint Intelligence Bulletin in May 2017 found that white supremacist extremism poses a persistent threat of lethal violence. Went on to say that white supremacists were responsible for more homicides from 2000 to 2016 than any other domestic extremist movement. 7 members of the committee joined me in writing a letter to you and Attorney General Barr explaining our concern about whether the FBI and Department of Justice were taking adequate measures to combat white supremacist violence and minimizing this growing domestic terrorism threat. The term white supremacist, white nationalist is not included in your statement to the committee when you talk about threats to America. There is a reference to racism, which I think probably was meant to include that, but nothing more specific. We live in a world where the neo-Nazis and white supremacists are taking lives in many places. A white supremacist murdered 51 Muslim worshippers in New Zealand. 2017, a white supremacist murdered 6 Muslim worshippers at a mosque in Quebec City, Canada. And in the United States, far-right extremists perpetrated the shootings at the Sikh Temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the Shabbat of Poway, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Poway? Synagogue in Poway, California. The reason I raise this is because there is a concern that this is not being taken as seriously as it should be, as one of the real threats in our country. And a concern as well that the FBI has now changed its definition when it comes to race-related crimes. They've created a new category for what you term racially motivated violent extremism. It used to be white supremacist incidents. Could you explain to me why there was this change, whether you consider this a serious threat, and what you're doing about it? I ask you this in the context of a national conversation that's taking place every single day under this presidency about the issue of race and incitements to emotion and violence by the people who are using race as the motivator.
So, Senator, first, let me sort of unpack your question a little bit. Needless to say, we take domestic terrorism or hate crime, regardless of ideology, extremely seriously, I can assure you. And we are aggressively pursuing it, using both counterterrorism resources and criminal investigative resources, and partnering closely with our state and local partners. In just the last little while, we've had cases involving, for example, the Coast Guard lieutenant who was planning an attack on elected officials and TV anchors here in this area. We've had militia members.
Was that motivated by a white supremacy belief?
I think it would be a version of that, certainly. Our focus, when you asked about the categorization, our focus is on the violence. We, the FBI, don't investigate ideology no matter how repugnant. We investigate violence. And any extremist ideology, when it turns to violence, we're all over it. And we've had, in fact, and that you don't have to just take my word for it, just in the first 3 quarters of this year, we've had more domestic terrorism arrests than the prior year, and it's about the same number of arrests as we have on the international terrorism side.
I ask you to clarify that, because when you talk, I don't know if we're talking about the same thing, but when you talk about homegrown violent extremists, and I talk about domestic violent extremists, are we talking about the same thing?
No. So we use the term homegrown violent extremism to refer to people already here in the United States who are inspired by different parts of the global jihadist movement to commit terrorist acts.
Okay,
we use the term domestic terrorism to refer to a broader array of threats ranging from anarchist extremism to different kinds of racially motivated violent extremism to different kinds of environmental extremism, et cetera.
So let me pursue that for a second. So the point I'm getting to, and the reason I quoted this unclassified report, is if it's violence that motivates the FBI investigation. What we have here is a statement in this unclassified joint intelligence report that between the years 2000 and 2016, the white supremacists were responsible for more homicides than any other domestic extremism movement. Now, I see the distinction you're making, homegrown versus domestic. But let me ask you, can you quantify either one of them for us?
Well, in terms of number of arrests, we have, through the third quarter of this fiscal year, had about, give or take, 100 arrests in the international terrorism side, which includes the homegrown violent extremism.
This year?
This year. But we've also had just about the same number, again, don't quote me to the exact digit, on the domestic terrorism side. And I will say that a majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence, but it includes other things as well.
I think this is significant. I do not want to diminish the work that you're doing when it comes to the homegrown domestic terrorism in any way whatsoever, not at all. And I understand that as a serious threat to the United States, and 9/11 is proof positive of that fact. But what you have just said is significant. If the number of people arrested this calendar year, when it comes to this extremist conduct, is about equal between those who were inspired by foreign actors, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever it might be, and those who were inspired by white supremacy or at least some version of race. Now, if that's the way I heard you say it, please clarify.
So let me clarify. What I just gave you were the number of arrests. The number of arrests. That's not necessarily the same thing as the number of investigations.
Well,
right? So that's an important distinction.
Assuming the integrity of your department, which I will, the fact that they would make an arrest, it is with the belief that a crime has been committed. The point I'm getting to is we are in a very tense moment in American history on the issue of race. We are having a national conversation that we haven't had in a long time about racism and the reaction, what's acceptable and what is not. And what I'm asking you from the FBI point of view, and what you've told me, is that we ought to take care, as seriously as we take foreign-inspired terrorism, there is a domestic terrorism underway in the name of race that is as threatening in some respects as the foreign terrorism. That's the way I hear it.
Yeah, I don't know that I think the greatest terrorist threat to the homeland is the homegrown violent extremist. I will say that we take
foreign-inspired,
which is jihadist-inspired violence. That does not mean, by any stretch of the imagination, that we don't take domestic terrorism, including hate crime committed on behalf of some kind of white supremacist ideology, extremely seriously. And we have had a number of very significant arrests. I mentioned the Coast Guard one, but we had militia members in Cleveland stockpiling explosives to build pipe bombs. We had the Cesar Sayoc case involving the package IED. We had the Rise Above movement, where we arrested 8 different people on federal rioting charges. One of them fled to El Salvador, and we got him back. We had the Tree of Life synagogue shooting case, which you mentioned, and the shooting outside San Diego, the attack in the synagogue there. We got 29 count, I think it was, conviction and life sentence related to the Charlottesville matter. So make no mistake, the FBI, working with our state and local law enforcement partners, is all over this.
Thank you very much.
Senator Cornyn.